Okay. Hi, everyone. My name's Aaron Masliansky. I'm delighted to be here to interview Anna Solomon, who is the author of the Book of V. I host a podcast called Inside the Skev, which is all about the people of Skokie and organizations of Skokie and Evanston, but it does touch on a lot of different subjects, so please check it out. But today we have Anna Solomon here, and this book that she wrote is called The Book of V, and it is really about, it's essentially the Book of Vashti. It's really interesting, especially if you're familiar with the Book of Esther and the Purim story, because it has a completely different take on it, and it touches on a lot of different subjects. So today I want to talk about that and talk about also just how it is to publish a book and do it in this current environment. So Anna, thank you so much for being here today.
It's my pleasure. Thank you for having me, and thanks to everybody for joining.
Yes. Yeah, thank you everyone for joining here. It's a pleasure to see everyone. So Anna, if people have not had the chance yet to read the book, if you could just give us a short synopsis of what it entails.
Yes, of course. So the Book of V weaves together the stories of three different women at very different times. One is a contemporary mother of two or 2016, I should say, in Brooklyn, New York, who is named Lily, who's sort of at a point where she is, she's a second wife, and she's kind of struggling with her intellectual and sexual desires. And then there's a second character in 1973, a senator's wife named Vivian Barr, who is banished, much like Vashti in the Book of Esther. And then there is a teenaged Esther in ancient Persia in 462 BCE, who wants not to become queen. And those are kind of the very, very bare bones descriptions of the women. And the book weaves their stories together in such a way you see that as the stories begin to converge, that though the challenges that each of them faces is of course very different, that the kinds of questions that they're asking around power, around identity, around desire there are a lot of similarities between them, and their stories eventually do also converge in the book. And so that's kind of the bare bones description. It really is about, I think, how women's lives and choices have and have not changed over time.
Right. What's interesting is that it's focusing on, in some respects, Vashti, and some of the characters evoke the thoughts of Vashti, but we're always taught if the story that Vashti did something wrong, and maybe she had boils all over her, or she didn't want to come out naked in front of Ahasuerus and all of his friends, and we're almost made to look at her as a villain. Why do you think that is, and is that what inspired you to write this book?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think that, so growing up, and as you're saying, I think, like the spiels of my childhood, Vashti was definitely seen as the villain, or one of the villains. Obviously, Haman is the villain of the story. But, she was often, the person who played her was often dressed like a, kind of like a prostitute, or that she was a leper was one of the stories, as you said, with boils. I mean, there were all of these stories, but none of them, I didn't really understand any of them. And I also didn't understand why she was banished, what made her so bad. And it wasn't until I sort of returned I was given a Book of Esther for children, like a children's version to read to my kids. And I started reading it to them. They loved it. And so I had to read it to them a lot. And I read it and read it and read it and kind of came back to the story and realized how much that story had been told about Vashti and about Esther too, to a degree, didn't really match up with the story itself. Like, well, wait a second, here's Vashti. She's saying, no, I will not come parade naked in front of you. Isn't that actually the virtuous choice? Like, why was she said to be wanton? And, look, here's Esther, whether wittingly or not, wow, if you really look at it, she's sort of, a concubine in a harem, right? Like if you really break it down, and nobody ever taught me to think of her as that, she was the noble, virtuous one. So I do think, I think that the reason, right, for the way that Vashti was portrayed is that her purpose in the story was to make way for Esther. The story is Esther's story. It's a story that meant to be uplifting to the Jewish people. So I see that. But yeah, I was interested in kind of what would happen if I went in and like imagined who Vashti really was and what what became of her.
Have you seen other people write about Esther or bring her story more to the forefront, um, like you've done, or is this the first time really that it's really come to the forefront?
Do you mean Vashti or Esther?
Vashti. Vashti.
Vashti. Well, I haven't seen it done in like a novel, for instance. There are, there were many, when you think of like the midrashim, really, right, like writings about original stories from the Bible, which my book now is sort of belongs to that category in its own way, right? Like you take an original story and play with it. There have definitely been plenty of writings about Vashti, but not sort of, I wouldn't say, works of art in popular culture. That there's some paintings that were done, like there's an amazing Chagall painting of her, but I don't know of other novels or films that have kind of really taken her as their center.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, it's an interesting perspective, and especially when you play it out with the other characters throughout time and how they share the similar perspective. But it's written from a woman's perspective. What is we were chatting a little bit before this all started that I'm the first man to actually interview you about this book. What do you envision, or what is the purpose, I guess, if you think about who's going to be reading your book, and thinking about it from when a man reads the book, what is your purpose for a man to be able to hear this perspective? Do you want there to be a change in attitude or a realization of different things that may not come across?
Well, I mean, I think that, I think the book, so I think, the men who read the book have said things to me like, this made me sort of really take in a different way what a woman's experience might be like from the inside, like on the interior and in her mind and in her emotional response to things. And so I think that, if it does reach men in that way, that would make me glad. It's certainly, and I don't write from a place of like, I have a message, I have a point I want to make. And I think the book is very much written, it is a book about women's lives primarily, and about, I think the attempt of the story is sort of, it's very much about storytelling too, and the power of stories and the way in which we absorb the stories we're told. And that way that we absorb them makes us experience our own lives as, have we matched up to those stories? Have we not? It's very much about that. I'd be really interested to know how it reads as a man, like whether, the experience for men in that way too. And it's not just, obviously this book is focused on the expectations and conventions that women often sort of come up against, but of course there are many that men come up against as well. And I don't know if there are ways in which it spoke to you in that way.
Yeah, I think it's, in certain respects, it not to say that I think I act in certain ways, but nobody's perfect. But you look at how the senator, like how he was trying to totally objectify his wife at the time, Vivian Barr, the character in the book, or you look at Ahasuerus. I find it very interesting how you write the Ahasuerus, the way that you characterize him as shorter than you would expect, and kind of just like this minuscule like person who is like terrified of Haman, and just not powerful. And you look at it that way, and I think that somewhat changes perspectives on the story itself. And again, it's fictional, but midrash sometimes is a way to explain the history. So it does open up different perspectives of like, hey, maybe it was different, and maybe it was somewhat more similar to that. And there's a lot more going on in the story than just from the male perspective. So I think that's something that came across from when I'm reading it.
Right.
Yeah. In terms of, characters, I would imagine that you identify in certain respects to the characteristics of some of the characters. And, I feel like I would imagine that your favorite character was Vivian Barr, because she was so strong and she took, her totally independent path. and
Hmm.
how she wanted to do things. Would you say that that's right?
I think, it's funny. I don't know that it would, I wouldn't say, I think that it's so interesting because when people have asked like which was your favorite character to write, it was Vivian Barr. And so I think you got that. And for me that was probably, largely as a writer because I had this experience when I wrote Vivian Barr, which is not a common experience for me, where as I really really knew her fully from the moment I started writing her. Even though, and it's interesting that you said that because a lot of people would say, well, you must be like Lily because she's the one whose life sort of on the outside looks the most like mine, right? Like I'm a mother of two who lives most of the time in Brooklyn and I blah, 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 blah. And I live now, right? But actually, yeah, I think that I found myself really getting Vivian Barr and she was just kind of came fully developed to me.
Mhm.
And I loved writing her. And one thing, and I don't want to give away sort of at all what happens, but one thing that I really enjoyed was being able to follow her as a young person and then an older person, and kind of meet her again and see what had, who she had, the ways in which she had changed, the ways in which she had not. But yeah, there is quite a bit of me in her. Yeah.
Well, I think it's a way of stripping away any of the requirements of just modern life in a way where, let's say, motherhood, being a wife, all these types of uh, um, what's it called? Just things that you are required to do, and just being able to do exactly what you want independently is that
Hmm.
type of character. I mean, as opposed to, I don't want to give away too much in regards to Vashti
Right.
throughout the story, but
Yeah.
it's kind of a dichotomy, or even looking at Esther throughout the story of
Right.
how she has to go through different things, and it's quite awful in certain respects. But you look at it where somebody can be more independent, and they're all striving for something.
Yeah. Yeah, that's right. And they're all, I mean, one of the things that was so interesting to me was seeing over time, right, the sort of the restrictions and the requirements and the expectations on them became less physical and more emotional and psychological, right? So like Lily's sort of traps, so to speak, are all kind of inside her,
Right.
right? Like they're not, she's not being physically trapped in a palace. She's experiencing herself in certain ways as like trapped and confused. And Vivian Barr is at a time in the 70s where there was sort of this betweenness, right? Like where a lot of strictures were sort of being thrown off, but she's still part of this world, especially in Washington, D.C., that's very, and in a social level, quite both very conservative and also sort of like crazy things are happening. So yeah, that was an interesting thing to kind of think about that arc and the different nature in which we are find ourselves or feel ourselves to be, oppressed, and the ways in which that shifts and changes.
In how you write, though, in certain parts of it, I would say it's very graphic in detail. As a writer, do you do that as a way to really get across the feelings of the characters, or what is the purpose behind that?
Well, when you say graphic in detail, do you mean, I mean, I've always used a lot of specific detail, but when you say graphic, are you talking specifically about sex or about violence or,
I would say about both sex and violence.
yeah. Um, yeah, I mean, to me, I am writing out of a desire to, um, allow people really fully into the complexity of my characters' experiences, and those are a large part of their experiences. And I feel like so I'm not interested in kind of like, um, you know sort of sweeping past it or not allowing it to play the full role that it in fact plays in their lives. And I think for these women in particular, I am, a big part of the book is exploring their relationships to their bodies and how they use their bodies, both how their bodies are used against them and how they also sometimes use their bodies to gain power. And I really wanted to explore the complexity of that, and not sort of, not, I think often there's a storyline around women as victims or women as aggressors, and like only one or the other. And in a lot of ways, right, the book of Esther traditionally has been read also in that vein. Like, well, this, not that Esther's necessarily, well, yeah, that she, I mean, that one is the noble one and one is the bad one, etc. And I wanted to kind of explore and explode a little bit those dichotomies. And I think one of the ways and one of the places that really needed to happen was in how I described their physical and sensory and sexual experiences.
Yeah, I definitely feel like when you're describing certain things, especially when Esther is waiting for to be chosen, in those scenes, you almost can feel like you're there with her, and it takes you into that place. So I think it's effective. You
Yeah.
know, when you write the story, though, there's a lot of different parts to it, and I'm just thinking as an author, how does the story come up? Do you know what's going to happen at the end when you start, or do you start writing and then it just comes to you?
Um, I'm a pretty structural writer in the sense that I start with I try to have a pretty solid sense of what's coming. It always changes as I write the book, but this one especially, because I had these three parts that I'm weaving together, I really needed to be very precise about the places where those junctures came, how the plot, where the plot points that I needed to hit and where the rhythms and the themes that ran through the book and how they worked. Some of that I really, so I kind of planned and planned and planned. And then of course things fell apart and I would have to replan. But I worked, my main sort of tool is very low tech, is using index cards. And I would put up for each, part one, part two, part three of the book, I would put up like one index card for each chapter. So here's a Lily chapter, here's a Esther chapter, here's a Vivian chapter, and I would put them up so I could really see the shape of how they were relating to each other and interacting. And I would put on them certain of the kind of gestures and pieces that run through the book, like sewing or humming or drinking alcohol or these different things. So then I could see their relationship to each other too. So I would say a mix of being both very planned and then being willing to be spontaneous and shift gears when I needed to. And of course, revise. Like so much of the book comes to being what it is in the process of the revision and the revision and the revision.
And getting it tighter. I mean, when you're writing though for one character, are you writing that at the same time that you're writing the other characters, or you're going with those index cards? Okay, all of Vivian's and all of Lily's. Like,
yeah, no, I wrote them in the order that they are read. So I went back and forth between them. I would go, I mean, I wrote the book in the order that you read it, except, I mean, again, there were revisions, but it was important to me that because I felt like it would be so key to the reader's experience, to the way in which those chapters fed off of each other, that I needed to do it in that way. Yeah.
Where do you learn to write like that?
Well, I think, I think by reading is sort of the biggest way, reading and reading and reading, but then at a certain point, turning your attention to the reading as a writer and making a shift toward, a lot of when I teach writing, which I do a lot, making a shift from, so, we all learn in English classes to start to figure out like, what does something mean? What are the symbols here? Et cetera, et cetera. And then when you shift gears toward looking at it as a writer, you're asking, well, what effect is this writer having? But then the question is, well, and how? What are they doing to have that effect? Like, oh, I was really interested, or I was really compelled here, or I was really bored there, or whatever. And then looking, well, what's happening in the writing? What choices is the writer making? And so you become over time more and more in control of those choices. And that's sort of the goal, is to gain more and more control. Yeah. But I also, I mean, on a concrete level, I took writing workshops after I graduated from college when I was starting to write fiction, and, found a community of other writers. I went to graduate school. So I went for 2 years to the University of Iowa at the writers workshop there, and just really, like engaged fully in a community of writers and in my own work. And so I think, reading and then practicing and just doing it day after day, it's very hard. It's not like nobody's sort of like ever like, yes, we will, write this book, we will publish it. It's like, you have to write it and see how it goes. It's not like, you never quite know if it's going to work.
Right. It's funny. I joke around with one of my friends how it's not how somebody's not going to bring your dream to you. You have to create it.
Yeah, that's very true. Yeah.
Did you start writing though when you were a teenager or as a child? Did you know that you'd have a knack for that? Like what inspired you to get into that work?
I think I always liked writing, but I wasn't one of those kids like some novelists will say when, I was like, I'm going to be a novelist, but I always was writing, and I was writing stories, or I was writing poems, or I did a lot of journalism writing, both from the time I was sort of in high school and then beyond. And I worked as a journalist for a number of years after college. And so it was like I didn't know what form it would take, but I just kept writing and writing, and I did love it. And I think for me it's always been a way for me to understand how I think and what I think. Like that's part of how my writing allows me to do that. But it wasn't until sort of after college that I was like, you know what, I think I wanted, because I was writing poems in college pretty seriously, not necessarily well. And I kind of had this pull, really kind of an urgent pull that came from inside me. And I haven't had this a lot in my life. And it was just like, you want to write stories now, like something in these poems wants to be something else. And so I set my mind about it. Like I'm going to start studying the short story form and writing them. And yeah. And I think I should say that probably, my biggest asset as a writer is my discipline, which you can hear me talking about there. Like I just am like when I set my mind to something, I just do it. And so I kind of set myself out to do that from that point on. And as I was, of course, trying, waitressing and doing other things, because you can't really just be like, no, I'll be a writer.
Well, it's funny is you talk about discipline, and I've heard of people who have wanted to be a writer, and they keep saying, I'm going to go write it. I'm going to go write the novel. I'm going to do it. And then they keep putting things off, and they don't go and do it until they actually force themselves to sit in the room and just start writing and see what comes out. Yeah. And I think that's true in anything that you want to do in life, that you have to just commit to it, right?
Yeah. I think it's very true. It's hard. You have to commit to it, and then you have to be willing. I mean, one of the things that's tricky, at least probably of many things, but certainly creating some, a fictional world is like, to say to the people in your life, like, I'm going to clear this space and time right now. I'm going to go make up some people, and I'm going to declare that that's important to me. It's a hard thing to do, right? And there's always, like, other things are generally always easier. Not everything. There's obviously many jobs in the world that are much harder on all sorts of levels, but like it's always easier to like go online shopping or to go, there's just, and so, which is, and one thing that I do is I use this app called Freedom, and I turn it on, and it blocks me from like, I don't check email. I don't check and don't go on the internet. I really protect that time, and that's really key to my capacity to do it.
I will be downloading that app.
Yeah, it's great. It's great. And you can do it for however, you can even do it for 10 minutes if that's all, if you're like, because at first it feels like, when I first did it, I was like, wow, I am addicted, because I had this like jonesing feeling. But then it really, I mean, what's amazing is now when I'm in the habit of using it for like 2 or 3 hours at a time, I can sit down and forget to put it on and then not check anything, because it's like I've given myself back the freedom to, focus. It's great. It's really great.
I think one of the things that you have to be able to focus on, though, is just the research. So I imagine this book didn't take you a day to write. I mean,
no.
Spent a lot of time. How long did it take you to write this book, and how much research did you have to do?
Yeah, I think overall it was probably like, it's fair to say it was about 3 years. It's always hard to tell with a book because you're editing and this and that. But I think 3 years is fair. And yeah, it was a lot of research. It was, the research that I've done in the past with the books I've written, where I'm looking into a certain historical period, etc. But then there was also this other element for this book, which was the research into the Book of Esther, which is not about like, what really was what's very interesting, what was interesting to me right away when I went to kind of learn about, ancient Persia, Jews in ancient Persia, is that all of the resources there are the Book of Esther. Like everything leads you to the Book of Esther saying, well, this is what it was like for Jews in ancient Persia. And then you start reading about, different, what scholars say, and you're like, well, of course, this itself is a fiction, right? I mean, different people would argue with me about that, especially if you have a fundamentalist approach to the work. But a lot of people see the Book of Esther as an early novel itself. And if you read it, I mean, if you really read it kind of openly in the way that I read it, which is, and using the JPS commentary, there's a woman named Adele Berlin who wrote and edited that, or translated and did the edits. She sees it as, that it's a carnival, burlesque, historical novel in a sense, and nobody really knows when it was written, who wrote it. It could have been written by Greeks. It's unlikely, but like there's many possibilities. And what happens when you start to look at it in that way, that's so fascinating, is you see, oh right, this is a novel, this is a book, sorry, that's written to create the holiday of Purim, which itself is this holiday that's meant to turn over the order of things, right? Like the high is brought low, the low is brought high. That's not because there was probably an orphaned Jewish girl who became queen of Persia. It's because what story did the Jewish people need at the time that this was created? It was a story that would be uplifting, right? And funny, and make you laugh, and make you, I mean, in the orders, the people are commanded at Purim to get so drunk that by the end they won't be able to tell the difference between Haman and Ahasuerus, or Haman and Mordecai, sorry. And so, the nature of the holiday is a very weird holiday for in as far as the other Jewish holidays go. God is not once mentioned in the Book of Esther. Like it's really, it's not it's not what we think of as a traditional religious book. And so the more I went toward it in that way, and the more I read the midrash that had been written by the Babylonian rabbis, and like all of these different groups of rabbis, and then all the way up to the early American feminists, and then to the second wave women feminists who were sort of reclaiming many of the early figures like Lilith, for instance, or Miriam, the more I sort of got this sense of just both how little we know, but also how fascinating the various interpretations have been.
Yeah. Your upbringing, were you observant, or how would you classify yourself as how you were brought up and where you are now?
Yeah, I grew up in a synagogue here in Gloucester, the only synagogue here. It's a conservative synagogue, but sort of, because it was the only one, I think one great thing about it, which doesn't happen as much in larger cities, I've found, at least since moving to New York, is that everybody belonged to it. So there were people who might have been, if there had been more choices, they probably would have been in an Orthodox synagogue. And if there had been more choices, they would have been at a Reform one. And so there was a wide range of people. And my parents were very active. My mother was the first woman president of it. And they both sort of helped lead kind of a movement I don't even know at this point, at some point, to like bring more renewal tradition in terms of like singing and just more sort of like hands-on participation. So we were very much part of it. And we were observant to, in the sense of like, always going to the high holidays. And I went to a lot of Shabbat services. I was bat mitzvahed, etc. I feel like my family now is less involved, but still observant. And we still do Shabbat in our home. And, yeah, so.
Well, I think, having that type of background, as opposed to if you have an Orthodox background and you look at it like it was actually written and it's true to its
Right.
order, it could have a very different feeling, and it may be harder to open your mind up to those types of interpretations, because it's incredibly heretical to think about it in that way.
Right. Yeah, no, I mean, I was very aware. I was like, so some people are not going to like this book, or they might not, or they might find it, and it's been really great I've been talking with people all over the country. Many people obviously are not Jewish at all who are reading this book, but the groups that I have talked with who are, it's such a wide range. I mean, at this point, I've really only had the chance to speak with one group that was sort of more rooted in an Orthodox community. And so that was really like a gift to be able to hear from them, their thoughts about it. I was really grateful that they'd been able to read it. And I think that overall I've been, reaching more of the communities that are more, whether it's conservative or Reform, just sort of more progressive in their ways of, that's the label we apply to it. You could apply all sorts of things, but.
Well, I can tell you from an Orthodox background myself,
yeah,
it is very interesting to hear the story in this manner.
Yeah.
But it's important to bring up these different, concepts and things about Vashti, because I remember just like as a little kid hearing the story, and then as I got older, going through high school, and like you start to like peel back the onion, and there were a lot of things that were discussed, like, whoa, this is totally different than what I thought it was going to be.
Yes.
Like that's not what I was taught. Like, ooh,
Right.
it is a rich story, and I think that, like you said, it's something where there needed to be hope. There was a time of despair. The Jews were banished from their land, from Israel, and in the middle of Iraq, or actually no, in Persia. I'm sorry,
In
but
Iran, yeah.
they were in Iran there, but they were in Bavel. So it was a very difficult time, and there needed us, if whether it happened or not, or every aspect of it, I think it was an important story in our folklore to have to be able to pass on.
Yeah.
But you were talking about, this is a little different, but you're talking about how you're talking to people all around the country right now. Obviously, this is a very different time to go and be able to go on a press tour for a book when you can't actually travel. I mean, you're in Massachusetts right now, in your mother's home. You live in Brooklyn. How is that been to adjust? I mean, you've been on Good Morning America. You're the chosen book for the month. I mean, pretty awesome that you've had these types of opportunities. Is this what you experienced with your previous novels, or what has it been like?
Yeah, I mean, my God, I feel like we're all just right now kind of like, what is happening, right? Like in each in our own ways. You know, honestly, when it sort of hit, whenever it was, well, I know exactly when it was like March 11th, because that was when it became clear what was happening, because my birthday's on March 12th. So I really remember
Oh
that.
wow!
And my book was coming out May 5th. And, at first I was just, I mean, along with my fear, like concrete fears around the pandemic and around my family and around like all of this, I was also like, honestly heartbroken. I was like, oh my God, I'm going to have this, I love speaking with audiences. I mean, it's not all writers feel that way. Like I really enjoy getting up in a room and talking. And the idea that I still haven't, been in a bookstore where like, I mean, they're open now, but like, but meaning like, like everything was just different. And then there was the part also that was scary of like, well, most bookstores are closed. Like, people be able to buy the book? And at some point it was like, will printers be printing? Right? Like there was really like a sense of like, no. And I have friends who their books had to get moved to different printers because the printer had shut down, the one that like was supposed to print their book that was about to come out, like really kind of and you don't, most of us publish a book like every 3 to 5 years. So it's not as if like this is just another book I threw out. It's like this is something you put a lot of time and energy and love in your life. So I feel incredibly grateful because on the other hand, this book has gotten more press and support than I've had before for my books. And I think it has wound up, even though like, do I know if it is the same as it would have been? I'll never know. But I do feel like it really was given a really great shot. And I feel incredibly grateful for the technology that has allowed me to reach so many readers in the way that I have. And I'm continuing to do, like it's just continues to grow. And people, the thing that is the most gratifying to me is hearing from readers, which I've had a lot of experience doing now. And it's just incredibly hearing how the book resonates with them in their lives. And then also hearing about readers telling the other women in their lives and readers in their lives, like, you must read this book. Because, that's what you want people to feel. And to hear how many book groups in particular are finding it to be really like rich for conversation. So I feel like, there are many things that went very differently than I wish that they had. And also I feel like I feel really lucky, and I feel like the book's had a really good start to its life.
Yeah. Well, what's so interesting, I think, is when you watch any of these shows and people are broadcasting from their house, it shows the democratization of media. And
Yeah.
you could be anywhere. You could be in a book club meeting with people anywhere in the world. You could be here talking to me.
Yeah.
All different types of opportunities that people, back in February would have thought, well, it can't happen. We have to wait and replan this, and when we could have her come in and
Right.
actually sit inside the JCC.
Right.
It totally opens you up to much more potential. I'm part of some other groups too, where they would always bring in people from all around the world to speak. Obviously, you can't do that right now, but they're having broadcasts with people in China and India. Like,
Right.
it's just
Yeah.
amazing what can happen if you just realize the technology is available.
Yeah, I mean, I did an event on Tuesday with the American Jewish University, which is in California. I hadn't heard of it before, and they were saying, that they often have they're people who, for a variety of reasons, can't get out on a given, either they don't drive at night or they don't, like there's so many reasons that people can't come physically. So then to open it up to them, there were 400 people at this conversation, and there were people there from Australia. There were people from, so it's like people to see the appetite for the conversations, and it's really great. And I do think, I mean, my God, I would never wish that it had happened in this way, and I really hope that all of us come out of this okay. But I do think that we've gotten this kind of glimpse into this I think, like, I hope that we can go back to having things in person, of course, but I hope that we also don't lose like the gift of this as well, because there's something really it's really been amazing. And I think that I've been able to reach not just places but people who wouldn't have been able to kind of have the experience as well.
Yeah, I
I'm
probably
going to just interrupt for a minute. To your
Yes.
point, Anna, the JCC has found tremendous success in doing programming like this. And there's lots of programs that we would not have been able to do because we wouldn't have been able to bring an author or someone to talk about Frank Lloyd Wright. So
Right.
I appreciate that you've reinforced the silver lining of what this pandemic has done. I think these types of things are really great for keeping community together in a good way and in a productive way. So thank you.
Yeah,
I think
thank
we've
you.
expanded community in a way because of that. So I think that's one of the keys that we need to appreciate through this. But you are in a different environment than where you typically write, I would imagine, Anna. How are you working on your next projects, and how does that adjust, or how does it even adjust the storyline of what you're talking about? Do you incorporate what we're going through right now into
Yeah, those are good questions. I've been right now, I mean, I think things are just going to keep evolving, but right now I've been waking up pretty early and taking the first, like, from like 7 to 10 and writing. And then I'm with my kids, there's a lot, there isn't, thankfully, like there's been sailing camp here. So that's been a huge gift, but it's like 3 hours, 3 times a week. So, my life as somebody who had, my kids are 12 and 8. So I thought that I was like done with the point where my kids were home all the time. Like they were, in school, they'd been in school for a while and like going to camp and stuff. So that's been a huge part of this. And I just, I continue to have to just adjust to the reality, and adapt my expectations while also staying really disciplined and like determined. And it's tricky. And I think, it'll shift again in September in other ways, I'm sure, that will continue to be tricky. And also to your point about the book, yeah, I've started a new book that it's so nascent, can't really get into it, but the idea has been, and we'll see what happens with it, that it was set in sort of a near future, like in 2032. And so, yeah, all of a sudden I'm like, oh, wait a second. I thought that would be hard, but now it might be impossible. Like, I thought that I had very little idea of what was coming our way, but now it seems even more sort of like, oh, who am I to even attempt this? But I'm attempting it. We'll see. I'm having a lot of fun with it right now, which is a good sign.
I like the idea that you're doing something about the future, because a lot of times it's the writers, it's the filmmakers, it's the people who have the creative visions that actually create the future. You look at one of my favorite movies, and this is more of a dystopian future in a certain way, but it touches on these subjects, but the Terminator. And they talk about artificial intelligence, robotics, all these different types of things. And this was made in 1984, the original movie.
Yeah.
That kind of pushed along a lot of the thoughts within computing, defense, whatever it may be. So it's important to like have those ideas and put them out there, because somebody might grab on that and then make that.
Right.
So hopefully it's a positive future.
I like that. I like that.
Yeah. So, if when you when you look at this book, what is really like the main point that you want people to take away from the Book of V?
I think to me, the idea is that what I hope for is that readers take away the idea that that we tell the stories sort of that we need, and that we that the more that we kind of start to write, I guess I should say, like our own narratives, the closer those narratives will be to the lives that we actually live. And I think that in that, I guess part of what I'm trying to say is that, and it's not just women. This book is largely about women, but that our lives are more complex than they are often told to be in the stories that have been passed down to us. And what I'm interested in is writing stories that really capture the full complexity. And I think the other important part to me, and this is really about women, is that we are, that my hope is that it leaves people feeling more connected to other women rather than in competition with them. I think that, that's a theme that runs through the book, and that I wanted to leave readers with.
Absolutely, that women can support women, and it's I totally felt that. So,
yeah, I'm glad.
Yes. Well, Anna, it's a great book. Everyone should please buy the book, The Book of V.
Thank you. Please
Again,
do.
An independent bookseller. If you can, support your independent bookseller. We really appreciate you coming on, and the audience for being here today and listening. And thanks so much for participating with the JCC.
Thank you. Oh, I wanted to ask, am I right that there were signed book plates sent specifically to the book bin? I thought it might be worth.
There were. I don't know if
to that. So people, like, do you have a link to their website where the book would be that people could go to?
Mm-hmm. It's on our website.
Okay.
It was on our website, but
okay.
I can send it out.
That would be great. Yeah, that would be great. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you so much, everyone. Please check out jccchicago.org. We have more authors coming up next week. We've got a cookie baking, decorating demonstration, and some film discussions coming up as well. So thanks, everybody, for joining us. Anna, thank you. We appreciate your time.
So
Erin, as always, thank you. Take care, everyone, and be well.
Be well. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.